Supposing you found the perfect property in the perfect location, the seller ever has the seal of owning. But in the eyes of the government, you might not technically own that land yet. Today, in this video, we'll be talking about the governor's consent. Whether you're buying, selling, or using the land as collateral, you will need the governor's consent. And why this is necessary is because in 1978, the Land Use Act of 1978 passed the law that all lands are held in trust by the government. So let us explain what the governor's consent is, why it is important, why you should know it, and why it is necessary. So in defining the governor's consent, we have to go back to the Land Use Act of 1978. Like I said earlier, Land Use Act of 1978 states that all lands are held in trust by the government of the state. So if the C of O is given to a person that buys a property, it means that he's the first person to ever make a transaction for that particular property. So that's the first ever transaction made on a particular piece of land. The buyer is given a certificate of occupancy. Subsequent transactions on that same piece of land, that is, if the person that bought the land from the government wants to sell the land, or that is, if the land is about to change ownership, what the new or the current owner of the land will get is a deed of assignment and not technically a C of O. And because you're not getting the C of O, what you will need accompanying the documents that you get, be it the deed of assignment, the deed of the global power person, the deed of use, whichever one you're getting depending on the property you're buying, you will need the governor's consent attached to that title. The governor's consent is not necessarily a title document. It is just an approval by the governor that he is aware that you are purchasing this property and that he approves a transaction. So the key point here is that the C of O is issued once, that's to the person that makes the first transaction for a particular piece of land, while the governor's consent is given for subsequent transactions for that same land. So why do you need the governor's consent? It serves as legal protection, because in real estate, there are often problems or there are often legal issues that arise in terms of the sale of land, and the governor's consent shows that this land is given to you by the government and it protects you legally from any form of issues. Another reason why you need the governor's consent is that if in the future you will need to get a loan from the bank, you can use the property with the governor's consent as a collateral. It's just basically the governor saying that he approves that this loan should be given to you because you have this property that he also gives to you. Do you understand what I'm saying? So properties with the governor's consent can be used as collateral to get loans from the bank. It also protects you from double sale. So take, for example, you've been sold a plot of land, and let's say the seller is a greedy person, or let's say the seller is not a very good person. Let's say the seller is not a lovely person like you and I. So the seller wants to sell the same property that he sold to you to another person. The next person cannot obtain the governor's consent for that property because that property has already been sold to you and it is seen in the eyes of the government as it already belongs to you. So the governor's consent cannot be given to the next person, and that's why it protects you from double sale of property. What's the process of getting the governor's consent? Governor's consent is not given immediately you buy the land. It's not given immediately you get your title documents. What you have to do, the first step is apply to the Ministry of Land. When you apply to the Ministry of Lands, the next step is for you to get your title document. Whether it's your survey plan, your deed of assignment, your irrevocable power of attorney, whatever the documents that are requested by the Ministry of Lands, it varies from state to state. You get those documents and you file it to the Ministry of Lands. The next step is that the Ministry of Lands values the property. Different properties have different costs when it comes to obtaining the governor's consent. So they value your property and they determine the amount you're supposed to pay to get the governor's consent. The next step is for you to pay. The necessary payments for you to obtain the governor's consent varies from state to state, but there are payments you have to make to obtain the governor's consent, and that's the next step. You have to pay to obtain the governor's consent, and then you wait for approval. What this means is that the Ministry of Land checks that the use of the title is valid, that you actually paid for this property, and that you actually own this property, and then and only then, if approved, you get the governor's consent. There's certain myth about the governor's consent, and I'm here to debunk those myths. The first myth is that the C of O is enough. C of O might be enough for the first person that purchased the property. But if you're making a subsequent transaction on that property, you will not get a C of O. Basically, the C of O is not enough because you don't have the C of O. What you will need is the governor's consent. Let me just say that the governor's consent is just as important as the C of O for subsequent transactions. Another myth about the governor's consent is that it takes years to get. Though getting the governor's consent takes time, it doesn't take as long as you might think it does. So the final myth is that it is too expensive. Though it costs money, it is not as expensive as you think. Everything is expensive actually, but the governor's consent is not as expensive as you think. So I hope I've been able to throw some light on why the governor's consent is important and why you need it in real estate property transactions. So until the next video, I'm Victor ND and I'll see you later.